Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Humane AI Conversations. This will be the last conversation of this year, but it will also be a first because it will be the first of our new podcast that we intend to launch. And we are very happy to welcome Nick Diakopolous today. So Nick is an associate professor in communication studies and computer science at Northwestern University in the US. He's also the director of the Computational Journalism Lab there. And we are very happy to have such a leading scholar in the field of AI journalism. His most famous work probably is his book on automating the news, how algorithms are rewriting the media. It was published with Harvard University Press. And we are very happy and lucky to have Nick not only today in our Humane AI Conversations, but also he spends his sabbatical here in Amsterdam with us. So we are very happy to have you here, Nick. And we will start with a short primer on the topic of synthetic media and the news. And then we will ask a few questions. So me, Christopher Starke, and Mathias, we are both postdocs here at the RPA Human AI. We will ask a few questions and then we will open up the floor to the audience. But since we are recording it and since we want to then publish it later on for reasons of privacy and we don't want to get consent from everyone, please ask your questions in the chat and then we will read them out to Nick so he can answer then all of your questions. So again, Nick, welcome. We're very happy to have you. Please share a few thoughts on the topic of synthetic media and the news with us.
All right. Thanks so much for inviting me to be on today. Admittedly, the podcast format isn't one that I am so used to, but I'm happy to kind of keep it a little casual and just share some ideas that I've been thinking about with respect to this topic of synthetic media and news. And so, yeah, just to back up for a second, I study computational journalism, right? And really what that means is kind of studying the advances of algorithms and automation and AI on the production and dissemination of news information. And, as you mentioned, at Northwestern, I run the Computational Journalism Lab. And I've been working with a number of graduate students to explore these questions. So we've got a lot going on in the lab, studying news distribution on TikTok and Facebook, studying personalized news content, developing tools to support science journalists. And some of these projects are starting to intersect with this new technology of generative AI or synthetic media kind of models that I think we're starting to hear more and more about ChatGPT, GPT-3, Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, DALL-E, all these kinds of AI models that can be used to generate media, whether that's visual media or textual media or other forms of media. Some versions of these models can generate can output 3D meshes that can be used for VR or AR, and on and on and on. Yeah, I mean, it's funny, you also mentioned my book, Automating the News, and I actually, so the book came out in 2019, and it covers, a range of different applications of AI and news prediction, whether that's kind of data mining or bots in social media, news distribution algorithms, also automated content generation. But mostly what I was talking about in the book in terms of automated content generation is sort of like, template-based production of content. So where you have almost like a Mad Lib style of template, it gets filled in with data. Various versions of that can be more adaptive and dynamic and so on. And even though the book came out in 2019, I wrote most of it in 2017. And in the book, I will say I was a little bit dismissive maybe of the technology that's turned into these more generative AI models. I wouldn't say I entirely dismissed it. I mean, I did reference it. There were early versions of these technologies available. and they weren't nearly as compelling in 2017 when I was looking at them. So 2017 was when you started to see maybe some of the first realistic faces being generated by some of these models. The text production at the time was still a long way off from where it is now. And, you know, I guess we should expect these technologies to continue to improve in the quality of the output that they offer. I think, you know, 5 years later, the technology has just kind of begun to really prove itself out, and has gotten a lot better. So, yeah, the latest hyped thing that people have probably heard about is ChatGPT. You know, if you Google that, you'll find an online demo, and for folks who haven't played with that yet, I would certainly go play with it. You know, you can prompt the chat system, the chat API, with different requests. Like, you know, you can tell it to write 3 newsworthy headlines for the following article, and then give it the text for the article, and it will generate some headlines. And, you know, usually the output is pretty sensible. It's readable and typically, at least logically, consistent. And, you know, there's been a lot of hype on this online, right? I think, you know, I've even read some hot takes that, you know, this is going to be the end of the college essay, that people, you know, can just prompt the AI for a complete essay and turn it in, and get a passing grade, basically. And, you know, I don't know that that's necessarily going to be true, but I think it is true that the technology is going to disrupt, I think, many different aspects of media and communication, different aspects of communication industries, both with the text models and the image models. It's going to make all of that a lot easier and faster to create. I think, you know, we'll see it probably in parts of the industry, like press releases, you know, those kinds of press subsidies, kinds of information. Maybe even before we see it in journalism. But I will say, I'm kind of looking forward to the next year, and journalists maybe starting to flesh out a little bit more about how these tools, these models, could be productive in journalism. So, you know, I don't think they're going to be able to write entire articles per se, but I think there might be ways where they can maybe shave off a little bit of time, maybe make newsroom production tasks a little bit more efficient. I think journalists are just going to need to test the possibilities, test the boundaries of the technology, you know, basically just start exploring how are these power tools going to best be adapted to the needs of journalists. So I think there'll be a lot of experimentation needed. Sometimes people talk about prompt engineering. I kind of prefer like prompt design or prompt writing. You know, this is the idea that you have to like carefully craft the prompt that you're inputting into the model in order to kind of get the most out of the AI, and figure out how to control the AI in a reasonable way. And on top of that, I think, you know, there's some pretty serious ethical thinking that needs to go into this on the part of journalists, in terms of when is it actually appropriate to use these models? How do we use these models responsibly? And so on, in terms of labeling, in terms of which use cases it actually makes sense for. And, you know, already the tools can do a lot. I mean, you know, you can, I mentioned like headline writing, but you can also have the models rewrite text to simplify it. You can have it summarize documents in different ways for different use cases. You can have it brainstorm angles or potential directions for reporting. I've started to play around with prompts that I will say I'm fairly impressed with the model to be able to kind of act almost as a sounding board, where you can kind of ask it questions like, hey, what are the different stakeholders that might be impacted by this, you know, news event? And it will like brainstorm like 9 different stakeholders. And then you could follow up with it, because it's a chat interface, and say, well, how is, you know, stakeholder number 3 going to be negatively impacted by this thing? And it will kind of give you some ideas and give you some explanations. That doesn't necessarily mean that the reporter has to go and do those things, but I think of it as like a brainstorming tool of helping develop a line of thinking or a line of reporting. I think there's use cases in data journalism in terms of classifying documents and extracting data from documents. I mean, these are just very flexible models that I think it's going to take some time to kind of explore what the capabilities are, and what the boundaries of those capabilities are. I would say the main limitation currently is that these tools are still biased in terms of the data that's been used to train them, and they can still output bullshit, right? So it generates fluent text, but that text is maybe not grounded in reality in the way that we would want it to be in the news domain. So these models can kind of hallucinate text, but do so in a very kind of compelling and confident way. And of course, that means they're also great tools for creating disinformation and potential propaganda campaigns. And so this also creates a dynamic, I think, for the news industry where these tools are going to be used by different actors in the communication space, whether or not that's like full-on like malintent on the part of propagandists who really want to push particular messages, to maybe more soft but also kind of undermining press releases, or kind of pitching journalists low quality kinds of ideas for things. But also, I think it's going to create a dynamic where fact checking just becomes a lot more important. So I don't think, if you're going to use these tools internally to the newsroom, I don't think you're going to be able to publish the output of these models directly to a website. I think you're going to have to check it. I think you're going to have to check it for accuracy. I think you're basically going to have to fact check it if you want to publish it, or you're going to have to figure out some kind of use case where, again, like I said before, it's more of a brainstorming tool. It's more like suggesting ideas. And then you're kind of like iterating on those ideas based on everything that you know as an expert, as a journalist who's covering the story that you're covering. At the same time, there is research, and if you look at Archive, the preprint server, there's new research coming out all the time, blazing ahead, and people are working on how to make these models more factually accurate. And so it's not there yet, but if 5 years ago I was quasi dismissive of the technology, maybe in another 5 years we've really kind of cracked the nugget in terms of getting models to output mostly accurate, mostly factual content. And in terms of like the bias that can be in these models, I think there's, I could sort of make a call or a plea for news organizations to actually invest in this, right? To actually put some resources into R&D to fine tune these models, to adapt them, to better align them with journalistic needs, to really do the kind of evaluation of the models to understand the specific biases which might be relevant to their use in the newsroom, and then develop versions of the technology that are better for the newsroom. So I mean, I don't want to take too much more time here, but I guess I'll just say, I'm sort of cautiously optimistic about the technology. I don't want to hype it. That's definitely not the angle I have on it. But I am optimistic. I think if, given some time to explore the technology, I think there are going to be some valuable use cases that come out of it. I think there's some work to do on the ethics side. I think there's some investments to make. I think there's some creative work to do to play with prompts and to figure out how to write prompts effectively. And I guess we'll see, what the next year brings in terms of how this plays out.
Well, thank you so much for this short input, Nick. I think there's so much we can touch on. But first of all, I'd like to express that this is a very fresh perspective on the topic, because when I read on the hot takes, as you mentioned, there was a lot of doom and gloom, like how it will disrupt everything. But I think the more negative perspective on it prevailed, at least in the accounts that I read, and it's really nice to see such an optimistic view. But let's try to disentangle it a little bit, because from what I read, it ranged from it will kill journalism to it will save journalism, or even solve journalism. So obviously not all the different areas of journalism will be affected and disrupted in the same way. So where do you think is the largest potential for these kind of algorithms? Maybe also differing between ChatGPT and DALL-E, for example, when we think about, let's say, sports journalism or weather journalism, probably has different requirements than deep investigative work. But also in terms of geographical perspective, for example, we talked a lot about news deserts in the US, for example, but also with regard to journalism in the global South. So where do you think is which are the areas of journalism that are most likely to benefit, but which are the areas that are most likely to be threatened by these innovations?
Yeah, that's a nice way to think about it, because I think you're right that the impact of the technology will be uneven. I mean, if I look at the technology right now, I think it's probably going to be, most useful as an internal newsroom tool. And that is because of the current limitations on the accuracy of the outputs. So what I mean by internal newsroom tool is like any kind of brainstorming tool internal to the newsroom, any kind of tool which helps maybe summarize information or documents. You know, I've been playing around with it, as I mentioned, and you know, we build some tools in the Computational Journalism Lab and collect documents, for instance, and I kind of like have explored like inputting those documents into ChatGPT to have them summarize the documents or see if it can identify interesting newsworthy angles. I think summarization is actually like a potential key benefit that these models can offer, because you know, when you get into the guts of news making and news reporting, there's a lot of just reading documents, right? Trying to understand information, trying to understand what's going on in a document, whether or not that document is relevant to maybe some story that you're working on. And I think these models can be quite powerful as summarizers, and it could end up saving a lot of time in terms of journalists who need to go through a lot of documents and identify those which are maybe needing more attention, who maybe need to have a full read through. So I see a potential there. You know, I see potentially with publishable outputs in use cases like headline writing, for instance. Not that you would take the headlines generated from GPT-3 and publish them directly, but that you might suggest headlines to a social media editor as a brainstorming tool. Okay, what could be a headline here? Not to be taken verbatim, but as an option. And then, of course, you can attach that to other algorithmic techniques like A/B headline testing, and all of a sudden you're kind of just accelerating the potential of journalists to do that. Also, you could imagine the potential of these models, if they're fine-tuned in particular ways, to generate headlines for different audiences. So you want headlines that are more appealing to this demographic versus that demographic. You want a simplified headline, that kind of thing. You might be able to generate those using these tools. So I think there's some. I mean, you could almost say headline writing is a form of summarization. I think it's like a very particular form of summarization, but I think summarization is definitely an area where these models have proven their value, and so that's where I would kind of look for the potential. Now, in terms of the geographic perspective, I think that's a really interesting take on this. I mean, you know, I mentioned the issue of bias in these models. That's certainly an issue of concern, something that people should be wary of in implementing these things out of the box. You know, I mean, I think if you look at the data that these models tend to be produced on, or tend to be trained on, it tends to be English input material, which can have implications for the accuracy of the output of the content in other languages. Now, you know, there are alternatives to the big commercial players here. There is there's sort of like open source versions of these models. They tend not to be quite as accurate, but they are, let's say, trained on a diverser array of inputs, of input data. And so, you know, that may lend itself to better performance in different languages. So, you know, I mean, it's I think the geographic angle, I mean, you can look at through the lens of language, and I think it is pretty clear that these models, to the extent that they're mostly trained in Silicon Valley, they have certain biases towards English, and even though there are alternatives, I think, you know, those still need to be developed further in order to be fully competitive with the models trained in Silicon Valley. And of course, it's a resource issue, right? I mean, it's like these models take months and months to train. I mean, you have to have massive server farms. You know, I don't know what the estimates are of how much ChatGPT costs to train, but I remember seeing some estimates of GPT-3 a while back, and it's nothing to laugh at. These things cost millions and millions of dollars in compute power to train, which of course is not only a money thing. There's also you know, criticisms of these models on environmental grounds, because you know, you're looking at a lot of energy in order to train a model like this. So, you know, there's various different aspects of this, I think, to consider.
So one thing that you were mentioning was about these models. It's very expensive to train them, right? So far these tools are free. And one of the implications is that the people who have access to these tools, you know, in the future would be the one that have more access. So how do you think it can be possible that newsrooms use these tools? As you know, not all of the newsrooms have financial research to pay these technologies, and this infrastructure probably will be in the hands of some organizations. As we see right now, you know, these technologies are somehow open AI, and others are very influenced, you know, by these, you know, like these people from Silicon Valley. So how do you see that? I mean, do you think it's possible that news organizations use these tools in the future when we will be paid, and how we can, you know, make this available beyond this, you know, like these elite news outlets that have power and money to pay them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a super important question to be asking about these models in terms of access and availability. You know, I think about it. Maybe the trajectory or the analogy here is like other forms of technology that Silicon Valley has made available to newsrooms. I mean, you know, things like even basic things like Google Docs, like document management or spreadsheets. Obviously, there are paid versions of those things as well for organizations. You know, Google makes other tools that they've specifically designed for journalists, broadly available and free. You know, I mean, that could be seen as a form of subsidy to the news media, to the extent that they see that there's value in making these models available to news media. They might consider subsidizing the models for a broader swath of news media. I don't have any indication at this point to know whether or not that's what they're thinking, or if we're even there. I mean, I think the first step is to really kind of suss out the full capabilities of these models to be able to have arguments for their utility. So then you could, potentially think about whether or not that utility warrants seeking subsidies through the tech companies. That said, I mean, I think I think you'd have to do some back of the envelope calculations to see how expensive it really is to run these models, because I don't know that it depends on volume, and so it's going to depend on the use case of using the tool. But per word output for GPT-3 text is something like, I don't know, a thousandth of a penny or something like that. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's really, really quite small. And so you'd really have to be, churning out millions and millions of words of text from these models to rack up a substantial bill. So, I think that's another way to look at it, is that it might not be as expensive as we're imagining it, and I expect that those prices will come down. Just with kind of Moore's law, as computing gets cheaper and cheaper, I think some of those savings may get passed on in the form of these APIs. Another way to look at it is, and this is, I think, something that can be argued, is that maybe some kind of news organization consortia need to get together and start funding versions of these tools which are kind of owned by that collective, right? So in the US, it would be the Associated Press. In the UK, maybe it's the Press Association, some kind of entity which represents many other news media, which maybe has some more resources that they can invest to develop and refine the technology, fine-tune the technology, and then make it available back to the members of that consortium. So I don't know, that's another way to think about how this could play out. But I do think it's quite early now to really know exactly how it's which way it's gonna go.
I would like to zoom in on the individual journalists now. So everybody who has played around with the technology probably agrees that there is a disruptive potential in this technology, but nobody really now know how it will shape out over the upcoming years. As you said, a few years ago, you didn't even thought about it, and now it's here and it's already really good. How will the next iteration of these algorithms look like? So imagine you are a student who wants to become a journalist in the near future. So how do you think the job profile of journalists will shift in light of these new technologies? I mean, in academic writing, we say that, let's say 10% of academic writing is actually writing and 90% is editing. So will journalists also become like mere editors of AI generated text, or will there still be a need for original writing? Or how do you think a young journalist should prepare for these upcoming changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think, given the potential for disruption from this technology, not only in journalism, but I think in other aspects of communication industries as well, I think thinking about the educational implications is super important, to the extent that we want future generations to be able to use the technology effectively, but also I think adapt and to some extent reinvent the jobs that need to be reinvented, such that they take the best advantage of the technology as possible. So if I imagine I'm a student, I think it's just going to be important to have a kind of, you could call it like a literacy with these tools. So and I don't know that anyone started teaching a class on how to interact with GPT-3, but and maybe you wouldn't limit it just to GPT-3, but maybe there's a class to be taught there. I would probably frame it around like prompt writing, how to write for AI, and it would be how to be a writer in light of the idea that you can also write prompts to the AI to facilitate your own writing. I don't see this as a replacement technology for writing, but I do see it as an augmentation technology where, maybe I write something and as a first draft, and I say, I think this is still too jargony. And you then ask the AI to like de-jargonize it or simplify it. So there might be ways to iterate and kind of use the technology more as a sounding board as a writer. I think there are ways to think about writing, how to write the prompts themselves. I mean, it's not necessarily trivial to know how to get the best out of these models that you can get, and so knowing like how to phrase things, what kinds of action verbs to use, knowing that sometimes adjectives aren't well understood by the system. I mean, I think there's just it's like, what it's like. It's like learning to communicate in a very particular way, and I think that you can teach that skill to some extent, or you can at least give people the tools to explore that communication and through experience gain an intuition for the kind of quote unquote theory of mind of these AI models, how these models quote unquote think. And I'm saying quote unquote because I mean, at no point should we actually make the claim that these models are thinking or have any cognition. I mean, this is statistics. These systems have learned from massive amounts of text what the statistics of that text looks like. And it turns out that by simulating that at a massive scale, you can get something which seems like it understands your question and is responding in a reasonable way, but it is at the end of the day just statistics. So, hammering home things like that and understanding, I think from an educational point of view, understanding that that there are real limitations of these tools and knowing exactly the bounds of those limitations and what you can't ask them to do. Like for instance, these tools tend to be poor at cognitive reasoning tasks where there's planning involved. If you ask one of these chat-based systems to accomplish some kind of arc of a task with like a long planning horizon, it's not necessarily going to know how to plan all those bits and put them together in a way that would be meaningful. But you could break that task down as a human being. You could think through the task, break it down. Okay, I think the AI model can take care of piece number 1, and then I phrase a different task for piece number 2, and then piece number 3. And then as a human, I act as the editor and I kind of pull them together and orchestrate that. I think that's a potential model for working with these tools. I don't know. I'm kind of dancing around a little bit. I think there are some things that students will need to learn and how to adapt to work with these tools. But I don't necessarily have the syllabus in my head yet. But I think that's something to work on and think about.
Great, Nikki. Another thing that you mentioned and reminded me, one of my tests with this tool was I asked the tool to write an abstract with reference about data journalism in favela. So you mentioned about data journalism, so I'm coming back to that. And I was surprised how, was really nice abstract with a lot of inputs, reference. When I looked at the reference, I was trying to find them on the internet. None of them exist. And it's something that, even OpenAI has acknowledged that the chatbot has this tendency of respond plausible, but, answers that are incorrect or doesn't make sense, don't make sense. And one of the things that they mentioned also in the statement was it's really hard, difficult to solve that. So, and you mentioned a lot about ethical issues, how we can prepare not only journalists, but also the public in general to, with regard to that, like this kind of disinformation that we are seeing or misinformation that we are seeing from these tools. they're creating, and then being spread in the internet. And then when you read, it's really reliable text at first, but then you need to somehow have some literacy. And even people with literacy can, maybe understand that as something that was real. And then when you check and then you go do your verification, you realize that it's not. And it's the same for images, DALL-E is creating a lot of images, and then some of them, could be, like these deep fakes, reproducing someone else, and then it's not real true. So what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think fact checking is going to be a growth industry. I think that not only as an industry, but also as a state of mind for just existing online, knowing how to look information up, how to cross-reference information, how to go find original sources to verify something. I think there's like a version of fact checking that's kind of that I think is eminently teachable to the broader society in terms of looking things up, being skeptical, being critical of information that you're reading online. And unfortunately, I think that's the world that we're creating. When so much of the media and the content that's out there is going to be synthesized, I think people are going to need like supercharged media literacy programs. And so, I think that connects back to the educational component. I think that connects to a broad public educational component where people need to be educated. And then I think it connects to, where news organizations need to invest, where platforms need to invest, which is, again, fact checking and having professionals checking information and being able to debunk it and or add those references to it. Now, I think there's another way to think about this, and I've kind of again thinking about the next 5+ years of technical development here. I think that there could be advances in the ability of these models to be more accurate. And so if that's the case, then it kind of goes back to the more classic issues of disinformation, where you have actors who are kind of intentionally there trying to misinform and steer the content produced towards misinformation. I think to some extent we're already living in that misinformation world now. I think this technology definitely has the potential to turbocharge it. I think longer term, I'm just imagining some future where I don't trust anything that I come across on social media unless I know the person who shared it is a credible, trustworthy source for me. So, I know both of you. If I see that you share some information or a link on Twitter or Mastodon, maybe I think, oh, well, that really boosts my trust in the information that's being shared. But if I just see something from someone I don't know, maybe my default is to just tune that out entirely. And maybe my default is also to go to the trusted sources, like the media organizations who are spending the time to do the fact checking, spending the resources to do the fact checking, and coming to rely on those sources more and more as sources of information. So could this kill social media? I don't know. Maybe not kill, but maybe take it back to a kinder place, where maybe social media is about the social network, like your real social network, where you have more durable trust in the people that you're following, and therefore have some idea that maybe you can maybe you can let your guard down a little bit on what they're sharing. So, it's a good question though. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think that it's great that you mentioned fact checking as kind of like the default option when you see new information online, especially on social media platforms. And I was wondering, what's your take on AI technologies helping in that effort? Because I was playing around with the GPT detector on a Hugging Face and was surprised how well it could actually detect whether a text was written by GPT versus a text written by a human. So do you think that AI could also turbocharge, as you put it, the fact-checking process? Or do you think this will be a task that humans definitely need to be in the loop or have the final word on it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky. I think there's been a fair amount of investment over the years in detecting synthetic media, detecting deepfakes, and this kind of thing. I think that's kind of an arms race where you're going to have to constantly develop tools that can try to detect these fakes. I think that will be ever evolving, and oftentimes the tool that was developed last year to detect last year's fake doesn't work on this year's fake because the technology is constantly improving. You mentioned the GPT-3 detector. My understanding is that was, unless maybe we're looking at different versions, but my understanding that was like trained on an earlier version of GPT-2, and that's some of the statistical assumptions in GPT-2 don't necessarily hold for GPT-3 in terms of the statistical distribution of words generated from the model, and that therefore wasn't necessarily going to be an accurate detector. Now, is it a detector that might work sometimes? Yeah. And is it something that we should maybe run a study on to evaluate just how accurate it is at a detector? Sure, that might be a worthwhile thing to assess. But I don't know that you can necessarily just defer to one of those models. I think the version of the world that I prefer is where maybe you have some of that detection capability, but that's built into a human fact-checking tool. So at the end of the day, you kind of have a human who is interpreting the output of those kinds of detection models in light of context, in light of other information available about that content, in order to kind of come to a deeper understanding of the validity and the truth value of the content.
Thank you, Nick. We have one question that is very associated with what we are discussing right now from the public. You mentioned the increased importance of fact-checking synthetic media with techniques like inpainting, where objects are easily changed or inserted in a picture. How your opinion that will OSINT, or for visual investigations have to change? Because right now, uses open source investigative tools, and they are prepared to do what we have right now, right? So what can we still call evidentiary, and how, or more broadly, the question ends like that. So how will the practice of fact-checking have to change in the light of synthetic media?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a spot-on question. I haven't thought so much about OSINT and how that needs to change, but it would strike me that for any open source intelligence, the journalists who are investigating that would really need to look more at the context of the content and the network around the content. The context could be the network context, could be the temporal context, could be geographic context, could be metadata context, and use that to help guide the interpretation of that. I think that's something that folks doing OSINT already do, but I think it's going to be even more important in light of synthetically generated content. Now, so that's one thing to think about there. You know, will we call it evidentiary? That's tough. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you know, I think we've sort of been moving away from photographic evidence being evidence in the same way that it was in the pre-digital era. You know, I think that unless there are unless some of these other initiatives are successful, I think things could continue going that direction. And these initiatives that I referenced are coming out of companies like Adobe, for instance, you know, and there are some others who have content authenticity initiatives. So the idea is that if you have, like, say, a picture that has been authenticated at the level of a camera when that picture is created, and you have kind of a trustworthy way to authenticate that those pixels were the actual pixels that the camera recorded, and that in the file there hasn't been tampering with those pixels, then you sort of have some trust that, well, this image is the real image, and therefore any other image, including all of the faked ones, but also probably some other real ones, any other image would be sort of in another bucket of the, well, we're not sure about that. So you'll have some images that are authenticated, kind of end to end or glass to glass authentication, as it's sometimes called. And then you'll have everything else, which is kind of like the low trust visual content. So I mean, I guess we can still have visual evidence. I think, you know, there are industry players who are developing what that's going to look like and how that's going to play out.
So I have a very tough question for you, because there is not a clear answer to it. Obviously, it is looking into the future and assessing the different potentials of this algorithm, especially ChatGPT, for future iterations of this algorithms. So do you think, you said in the beginning that you underestimated the innovation coming out of this field 4 or 5 years ago. Now, let's assume that we still underestimate it now, and the future algorithms are very, very powerful. Do you think there is a world where actually a lot of what we know as journalism today will not exist anymore, because the algorithms have become so good that they actually write good, coherent, innovative new stories on maybe even current issues? So maybe even commentaries, maybe especially I'm thinking about sports journalism, or financial journalism or weather journalism that is very repetitive. Do you think these kind of industries are very much threatened by the algorithm? And even maybe not the investigative part of the investigative journalism, but the writing part of investigative journalism could actually be done completely by a machine. So do you think that we might have this moment that we have now with chess engines, for example, where we agree they play the best chess moves, so they are better than us humans? Do you think something similar could happen with journalism? Maybe not this year or next year, but in 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, looking really much further down the line, I think is hard to predict, of course. But my gut is telling me that there's not going to be as much replacement as maybe some would think. And that's because I think a lot of journalism, not all of it, there are bits and pieces of it that are more automatable, but I think a good chunk of it has to do with sort of complex communication skills, being able to get information out of sources who maybe don't want to share that information, or where you need to have some rapport or some kind of trust relationship in order to get that information. I mean, there's a lot on the information gathering side that that I'm not sure is going to be replaceable by these technologies, and that's kind of why I tend to see them more as augmentations and more as brainstorming tools to help journalists think through their reporting. So I mean, there's that aspect of it. I mean, I think there's also you know, the kind of the just the, I think a core premise of the news domain is that the world is very dynamic and new information needs to be interpreted sometimes very quickly in light of what it means for society. These models, I mean, ChatGPT, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's trained up until September-ish 2021. So what it knows, quote unquote, knows about the world, that is the data that it's been trained on, is already more than a year old. Now, how much of a limitation is that in the general use case for the tool? You know, there's some limitation. I think it depends on the specifics of what tasks you want it to do. Does it become more of a limitation in news? Well, yeah, I mean, it depends. Again, it depends on the task that you're asking it to do. But if you're asking it to interpret and write an opinion article on some contemporary topic, I think it's going to be lacking a lot of the context or the data, if you want to call it data. It might be just context that hasn't even been datafied yet. You know, it doesn't really exist as data. And so I think the ability for these machines to respond in a timely way is going to be probably another limitation that limits. I mean, I think we're going to see how far this technology can go. You know, like part of me thinks we're just still very early days. I mean, you know, let's see what happens if someone entrepreneurial takes the technology and says, you know, I'm going to try and reimagine a newsroom using this technology, and here's how things are going to work. Is that entrepreneur going to be successful? I don't know, but maybe by trying it out, maybe you figure out what works and what doesn't, and where there's a niche where it can work effectively.
So we have another question from the audience, Nick. That's also a tough one. So how will user trust in traditional media be shaped by these technologies? OpenAI algorithm is not an open source software, so it lacks this explainability of AI, right? So how can we enforce companies into a real open software direction? And also, thinking more broadly, so this open source and how we can make, you know, because this is a private organization, so how they can make this more clear, the data that they use to train, how, I mean, these models are being created to help people to understand what is this AI that they are using right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think transparency and explainability are really core to establishing, I think, the trust of the media in using these technologies. You know, I think there's various levels of transparency and explainability. I mean, I think there's the level of transparency and explaining how this kind of technology is being used in the newsroom to the extent that that it's used at all, and the specific ways in which it's used, or the specific ethical guidelines that are around its use. I think can help to build at least some base level of credibility for the organization in terms of how it's using these technologies. You know, in terms of like the open source dimension, I mean, as I mentioned before, there are open source versions of these technologies. You know, I think it would be a personal. I think it would be a perfectly reasonable route for a news organization to want to prefer the open source version of the software over the closed source version. You know, I think a lot of these models are available online for playing around with. So I think you could even try them out on Hugging Face and see, you know, how they work and whether or not they perform well enough for the use cases that you want. And one of the nice things I think about Hugging Face is that they make it possible to publish model cards with the models, and so that really exposes a lot of transparency about the data, about how the model was trained, whether or not there are specific ways the model shouldn't be used, and things of that nature, so so that you can really interpret, I guess, a little bit more closely and in a more nuanced way what the limitations are. So I think that could be a model for NORS organizations to, if they're using these technologies, maybe publish them to Hugging Face with model cards to be more transparent, at least to the extent that they can be.
Well, unfortunately, we have to come to an end already. It has been a really, really nice conversation. I think we could go on for another hour or two because it's such a timely issue. And who else to talk about this topic than with you, who has the expertise in journalism, but also in the computer science area of things. So thank you so much, Nick, for coming on today and sharing your insights and your thoughts with us. And we're looking to continuing this conversation with you. Thank you.